The 2023 UN Climate Change Conference will convene from November the 30th through December the 12th, 2023 in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. It will comprise, among other things, the 28th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, COP28, as well as the 5th meeting of the COP, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. For greater insight into what that forthcoming summit holds in store for Nigeria, we are now being joined from our studios in Abuja, the nation's capital, by Sam Onuigbo, who is member representing Southeast and Northeast Development Commission. Many thanks for joining us on Newsday. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much indeed.
Now, you've been championing the issue of climate change in Nigeria and Africa. This has seen you sponsor the Climate Change Act and even lead conversations to get other African legislators to do the same. Can you tell us what motivated you?
Well, first, thank you for the opportunity. The motivations are diverse. One is community, from where I grew up, where when we were in primary school growing up, we had 6 springs. And by the time one finished from primary, secondary, and then went to higher institution, worked and came back, out of the 6, 5 had dried up. Then the areas where we used to go to pick snails, run around, you saw that there were so many gully erosions. So that's for my community. And then if you check up north, you would then find that so many other areas that had green vegetation, like, between Yobe, Boronu, where people used to graze their cattle, or even Lake Chad, that had over 25,000 square miles of water. All these areas, as you know now, they have all changed. Either they're overtaken by drought and desertification, causing herders and cattle rearers to look for where to graze their cattle. And then, what goes along with it, insecurity and all that. And in 2015, when I attended COP21, I had the opportunity to participate in a GLOBE event. GLOBE is Global Legislators Organization for a Balanced Environment. By then, I was the vice president. And we were encouraged to push legislations on climate change because you need a legal framework to enable a nation and an organization to pursue. So these things put together, served as a motivation. Added to the fact that the climate change bill had failed in the 6th Assembly, also failed in the 7th Assembly, before I sponsored it in the 8th Assembly, and it also failed. Then I pushed it in the 9th Assembly when I was re-elected. And by the grace of God, we were able to get it together. The other thing is that I think it has helped in raising conversations about climate change, not just in Nigeria, but around Africa. And sometimes I spoke to some of our colleagues then when I was in Parliament across the world.
All right, so later this month, COP28 will begin in Dubai. What are your expectations for Nigeria and the African continent?
Well, the expectations are high normally because something very important happened this year where African leaders, gathered in Nairobi for an inaugural Africa Climate Summit. And it was just not African leaders. There were other people from international organizations and also regional, communities like ECOWAS and all that, to reach positions which they are going to canvass in Dubai during COP28. But apart from that, we also know our own position, national position, which is that we are a fossil fuel-based economy. But apart from being a fossil fuel-based economy, we also know that we need to really move along with what is happening around the world, like transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy and all that. So the African position is going to be generally the position of nations from Africa, while recognizing some of their, national positions.
So do you think Nigeria is ready and has a unified list of expectations which it will drive for at COP28?
precisely what I just said now. Our position is clear. We are keen into the African group of negotiators, which they are drawing from the resolutions of this inaugural African Climate Summit. And once we go along that line, we are not going to go into it, with our eyes closed. Why we are discussing that, like one of the resolutions of this African Climate Summit is that we should have a global climate, finance to help countries like Africa that are worst hit, even though we are emitting less than 4% of the greenhouse gas emissions, so that this finance can take care of them in a specific way, not to be, pushed into either you go to World Bank or you go to IMF with all their very difficult conditions. So Nigeria is going to benefit from the final resolution, while also opening her eyes to the fact that, yes, we need to continue to move along with our oil, but we need to start transiting, because all the major markets, China, United States, Europe, they are transiting very fast. And if they move ahead of us, or if they move and leave us behind, we probably not have anybody to sell our fossil fuel to as our major source of revenue.
All right, you have generally been seen as a champion of climate change. In fact, some see you as the father of climate action in Nigeria. How will this Onuigbo Climate Change Act on the Northeast impact on Nigeria and then the continent?
What we have been able to do, particularly the Ninth Assembly, was to get this climate change legal framework in place so as to serve as a guidance. And that is in place now. And I'm happy to say that the federal government has already established, in line with the provisions of the Climate Change Act, the National Council on Climate Change. A Director General in the person of Dr. Salisu Dahiru has been appointed, and he's been coordinating these activities. But it's also important to point out that this Climate Change Act, in its composition of the National Council on Climate Change, has the president as the chairman of the council, and in his absence, the vice president. Then with almost all the ministers, particularly those that are directly impacted by climate change, as members. But it goes beyond that to accommodate the sub-nationals. In this case, the chairman of the Governors Forum is also sitting there on that council. Likewise, the president of the Association of Local Governments of Nigeria. But in addition to that, we also have the private sector represented. We have women represented, not just from the Ministry of Women Affairs, but women in their special recognition. We have the youths, we have even the disabled, as well as people from the civil society. So the essence of this is not just to make policies in Abuja, but to ensure that such policies are cascaded to the grassroots through the subnationals, with the presence of not just the subnationals, but also the private sector. So for me, and for the Ninth Assembly, I think that was a major achievement. And of course, it's beginning to impact, because if you see what is happening in states like Ekiti, even Enugu that has passed their own Electricity Act, you discover that people are moving in a particular direction, even in Lagos. In fact, last week, we launched the mapping of climate activities in all the 36 states and the Federal Capital Territory. And there was a major revelation. Some states are low on the level of awareness, some are in the medium category, but some have already moved on with a lot of activities to show that, look, we are moving in the right direction, but we need to enhance or increase our efforts to be able to get to our destinations.
So what is your assessment of the position of the Tinubu administration on the issues of climate change?
The president has done well so far, because he has taken some far-reaching decisions, and I'll probably point out one or two. One, yes, he removed the subsidy on petroleum, which is a way to ensure that we become aware of what we ought to have done many years back. One, to save money, and then two, to really reduce appetite in terms of careless usage of all these things, and then contribution to emissions. But the other significant thing that Mr. President was able to do was to sign the Electricity Act, which in its content, particularly in sections 142 and 143, you would find massive provisions on how to use renewable energy to reach out to the population that do not have access to electricity. Now, what does that do for you? It enhances access, creates opportunity for development, so that the barbers and hairdressers and people who are at that level performing and contributing to the GDP, so they can remain active. In addition, we have just found that states, like I said earlier, are taking advantage of this. And the president has also launched the compressed natural gas buses. It's a step in the right direction, even if there's a little content of fossil fuel. But what it means is that this president is conscious of the fact that we have to move along, even while we take cognizance of our own position as a nation. So he has done well, and he deserves commendation.
All right, it deserves commendation, but there has been many calls for countries to move away from fossil fuel in order to guarantee a reduction in greenhouse gases emission. Now, Nigeria also committed to hitting a net zero by 2060. Now, considering that a huge percentage of Nigeria's revenue is from fossil fuel, what is the possibility of this, and what do you advise on the way forward?
Clearly, like I said before, if most of the perhaps some of the African countries, get their revenue from fossil fuel. I said this at the Scottish Parliament, that was in 2021 during COP26, that we are not planning to really transit into crisis, but we have to be conscious of what we are doing. So, yes, Mr. President, the former president made a presidential declaration that we are going to hit net zero in 2060. But in actual fact, the Climate Change Act, which we passed and which he later, signed, because by the time he made that declaration, he hadn't signed the act, provides for us to be able to transit between 2050 to 2070. That's the provision of the law. However, it is important for us to be conscious of the fact that countries like China, the European bloc, the United States, and even India, they are racing away in their transition. There's need for us to start early to prepare. Otherwise, we are not going to wait until 2050 or 2060 for us to do this. The need, in fact, it is now that we are going to plan. Yes, we said we want to transit into crisis, but if we fail to plan on how to transit, then it means we are planning to enter crisis.
Very well said. Early transition plan is key. Sam Onuigbo, member representing Southeast and the Northeast Development Commission, thank you so much for joining us on Newsday.